For purposes of the questions, I've abbreviated All Aboard Florida to AAF in some cases, and High Speed Rail to HSR in some cases, just to not have to repeat those phrases over and over again. The first question goes to Mr. Reininger regarding public versus private lending. In March 2013, Congressman Paul Ryan and Senator Jeff Sessions wrote a joint letter regarding the following Express West HSR RIF loan application. In that they stated, "We are deeply troubled by the prospects of subsidizing another risky HSR project, particularly when our nation is facing a debt crisis that threatens the well-being of the current and future generations of Americans. Since AAF's RIF loan application is for roughly triple the highest amount approved under this program in the last 12 years, why shouldn't we share these same concerns when it comes to taxpayer dollars being loaned to AAF instead of the company totally obtaining private lending?"
So that's a great question, and let me see if I can be fully explanatory around the answer. We're talking about the RIF loan program, the Railroad Rehabilitation Investment Fund. We have to start with what that program is and why it's there. It is a program that is designed to do precisely what projects like All Aboard Florida are looking forward to do, and that is to incent private sector investment towards the improvement of the nation's railroad infrastructure. It is in fact the incentive, not the subsidy, comes from a reduced interest rate, and it was built and designed in the way that it was in recognition of the fact that the commercially available debt for projects like this probably make it an infeasible business proposition. And so in order to make a situation come to light whereby a company can make an investment and use less of the dollars against a pure interest payment, therefore have more capital available to actually invest in tangible assets and the improvements that ultimately create the benefits for everybody that is a party to the system itself. That's the nature of the program that was put in place. With respect to all of the existing applicants that have received funding and those specifically the ones that you've referenced that did not receive funding, the fundamental difference between those applications and our applications are very, again, straightforward. In part, the reason that those applications were rejected is they had neither any equity contribution against their project. The project as designed allows for up to 100% of the total project cost to be financed through that program. And in the case of that example, I believe that virtually all of the capital cost associated with that project was included in the ask for that loan, which is to say they didn't have any private equity cash contribution against that business plan. Secondly, the loans are collateralized. These loans are actually secured in two levels. The first level is through the assignment of something that's called a credit risk premium, which is an upfront cash payment that the applicant would make, and that goes into a pool that provides a reserve of security against any defaults that may come out of the entirety of the system, not just the individual loan application that's being considered. It is also secured by the actual collateral that is being put up in reference to the loan application. And that collateral is assessed at its transaction value, which is to say the value of the collateral if, in the case of a default, it needed to be liquidated. And the amount of the loan that ultimately gets approved is only the amount of the loan that is backed by the liquidation value of that collateral. So if the collateral isn't worth as much as the loan doesn't happen, or the loan gets reduced. And it is because of a lack of collateral and a lack of equity contribution in other examples that those RIF loans, in fact, did not happen.
I have a quick follow-up in regards to that, because you did touch on some of the issues why RIF loans have been not approved in the past, but there was one that was not mentioned, and that was in regards to that Express West RIF loan in particular. In June 2013, then U.S. Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood indefinitely suspended the previously mentioned Express West RIF loan application, claiming the company did not meet Buy America RIF loan provision guidelines. Does AAF meet those Buy America guidelines? And if so, has proof of that been made available to the FRA and the public?
Really simple answer. 100% compliance with the Buy America provisions associated with the RIF loan program. Frankly, with or without a RIF loan, we're going to be 100% compliant with the Buy America provisions, as well as many other provisions. As part and parcel of the application for the RIF loan, and in part and parcel of the approval of things like the rolling stock that would go through the regulatory processes associated with the Federal Railway Administration, all of those conditions of Buy America are made available to them. They are reviewed and they are approved, and they are a fundamental, not only compliance with, but the proof of the actual result of which is a condition of any funding approval that would come along with the loan. So simple answer, absolutely.
Great. This question is for Commissioner Solari. The Indian River County Commission and yourself originally supported AAF. Now the County Commission as a whole has rescinded that support to a position of stated neutral. Proponents of AAF state this is due to local politicians focusing on inaccurate notions regarding AAF, rather than listening to AAF's claims that the project will generate more than $192 million in economic impact for our county and create almost 400 jobs during construction. Mr. Reininger's reflected on that earlier. Bob, please state your position now on AAF, neutral or opposed, and the primary reason for your change from your original position.
I'll try to answer most of that question. Initially, I was for the project because I was told by Representative Ward Florida that this was a private project on private property by a private company. They never mentioned the RIF loan. Now, obviously, there's a difference in definition and understanding of a subsidy being a pecuniary aid by a government to a private company from 99% of Americans and those friends and investors, the Fortress Investment Group and their companies. But a subsidy is a pecuniary aid given by a government to a private company, and that's what they have here. I addressed $192 million of economic stimulus and 400 jobs earlier, and yes, it's nice to get them, but they're temporary, and at the end of the day, basically we're paying for our own funeral. We've seen what the wrong type of burst of economic activity that's underlined by bad financing can do to this community. We lived through that in 2007 to 2009. That was the government, driven by the government, helping to press and give loans to people who shouldn't have gotten them. So, getting back down now to the bottom line of the question, which is what is my particular position now? My particular position, I think, was outlined in my comments. I believe that this is my belief, and I think I substantiated that belief. What I believe that all we're hearing is half-truths. I have a hard time believing that Fortress and its companies don't believe that this is a subsidy. Until I hear that they understand what their obligations are to our community, I will be against this. And I will certainly not be for this project until I can look at an investment-grade business plan and see that it makes sense. This is the one and only thing I asked for 4 years ago with Amtrak, and it is the one thing I'm asking for today. And if they want to continue to say that, well, you've got no right to it because there's no subsidy, then I don't believe that the dialogue is going to go too far. Thank you.
This is a follow-up for Commissioner Solari, specifically discussing the plans in the future possibly for a stop here in Indian River County. If there was a stop plan for Indian River County, either now or definitively sometime in the future, would that at all change your position on the project?
This is another one of those half-truths. All aboard Florida a number of times, including Mr. Reininger Monday at the High Speed Rail Commission, and Mr. Roberts at different times, have alluded to the fact that, or basically stated, allow us to start the project and get it going. Then we'll come back and discuss a stop. But they never mentioned two different things. One, for a stop to be financially feasible, and that's what Mr. Roberts said it would have to be. It would have to be financially feasible. You need density. You need the density of Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. This community does not want the density necessary for transportation-oriented development. It has made it clear a number of times. And again, another thing that I've never heard them say in these conversations is little things like in their Orlando-Orange County Expressway Authority lease. In that lease, if you read the paragraphs, it basically gives the Expressway Authority a right of first refusal on any project. Basically, unless they're convinced that it will not undermine their revenue stream, they can block any station between Orlando and Palm Beach County. But I've never heard them say that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the basis of my problem with All Aboard Florida. They say half of the story. Two half-truths is not a whole truth, and as that they continue to tell just one side of the story and one portion of it, again, we're never going to have the dialogue that we need. And I'll just finish well. Thank you.
Are we going to have a chance to respond to that?
I'm going to ask you a similar question along those lines, Mr. Reininger. Yes. A December 2013 report by the Congressional Research Service found that HSR is heavily dependent on high population density areas, both here in the U.S. and worldwide. Do you feel this is the case? And if so, with that being the case, would there be any possibility that Indian River County will see a stop sometime in the future, seeing that we are not a high population density area?
So let's see if we can be incredibly clear about the answer to these questions, because somehow this seems to be confusing to Mr. Solari. On the issue of the clarity with regard to the Expressway Authority lease agreement, the document's a public document. It's totally transparent and available to anybody that wants to read it. It doesn't give the Expressway Authority a blocking right. What it does is gives the Expressway Authority a mechanism to protect their bondholders and the Expressway Authority a way to uphold its fiduciary responsibility to those bondholders. Let me explain very clearly. The Expressway Authority built a road for which they charge tolls. That road was funded by bonds. Those bondholders gave the money for that road, and they get paid back by the tolls that users of that road ultimately pay. To the extent that there is any situation where our service would somehow create a negative impact to the revenue stream that those bondholders are obligated to, that revenue stream needs to be balanced in some way, shape, or form by some payment that keeps those bondholders held harmless from the obligation of repayment of those bonds. Those conditions of that lease agreement were structured quite clearly around that very real responsibility that the Expressway Authority has. We believe that to be a completely fair request, and that's why we agreed to it in the negotiations of that lease agreement. Specifically with regard to a stop anywhere else along our system, what we have said is what we're doing is incredibly hard. And in order to be successful, we know that we have to concentrate our resources and our energies around the core business proposition. And I earlier defined what that core business proposition really was, and it was providing services to those two types of characteristics that we have learned to be the reasons for success for passenger rail around the world. In some instances, that requires a density and an availability of customers that are close by your station location. Those are the component parts.
Hold on one second, let us try to address this. If somebody from the country club here could help us with the sound system for a moment.
I'll just speak louder, that's okay.
That's fine. Okay.
I'll just speak louder, I'll do the best I can. So clearly, our first phases are built around those business characteristics that we have identified as the ones that make passenger rail work. Once that business is up and operating, we will do what any private sector business ultimately will do, which will be to look for ways that we can expand the business and attract new customers. And if that means by serving new markets as an extension of a base system, that is of course what we will do. Does this community want to stop or doesn't it want to stop? That's an important question that will have to be studied. If the answer is it does want to stop, any stop that would be produced here would have to be something that is an economically feasible proposition. That would have to be determined by an understanding of the demand, an understanding of the costs, an understanding of the revenues to see if the outcome of that scenario is in fact a reasonable business proposition. If it is, we can entertain that notion. If it isn't, the simple fact of the matter is there can't be a station here because it is an infeasible business proposition. When you look at the characteristics of the portions of the Amtrak system that don't work and that do require your federal tax funds to subsidize, it's because they're providing services to places that are structurally infeasible. That's not what our intention is. We won't enter into those kinds of situations. So any discussions about where the business expands beyond our first two phases are going to be based on that very logical and very rational business approach to the feasibility of the expansion of that business. I hope I don't think I can be any more clear than that.
Thank you. Sorry about the sound system there for a moment. If anybody is listening at home on WTTV, thank you. This question is for Commissioner Solari. You briefly touched on this in your opening comments, and obviously I did not know the opening comments by either of you, so I had to address my questions accordingly. Mr. Reininger recently wrote that safety is our unwavering first priority. For this reason, every grade crossing along the corridor will be upgraded, and these improvements will be paid for entirely by All Aboard Florida. This will create the safest railroad in the country. Absent AAF and its investment, these improvements will not happen, and the current freight service will operate into the future on the system as it is today. Safety concerns are often raised by those opposed to All Aboard Florida. Yet here, Mr. Reininger clearly states that All Aboard Florida will indeed improve safety. Do you agree that AAF will improve safety? And will the taxpayers bear the burden for these certain types of improvements in the future if AAF does not make them now as part of this HSR project?
The idea of safety is, and what All Aboard Florida will do is in this sort of fluid process. My best understanding at the present time is that AAF will do some and maybe a substantial amount of what is necessary for the county to eventually get quiet zones, but not all. So I think they've been moving in the right direction, but that they have further to go. What I have not seen is a very clear commitment not to put in all the safety requirements that are required by the regulators, but all the safety requirements to protect the citizens of Indian River County. And again, if we don't have a conversation about deaths on the system, how can we say that we've done the right thing for safety? My understanding is that on the FEC system there have been about 71 deaths in the last 15 years. But I've never heard them mention that. And their attitude is that if somebody crosses the tracks and gets hit, they're a trespasser. Now that may be technically true, but when I went up to, as part of this process, up to Sebastian, and I was looking at the FEC tracks, there's a sort of hill that's going up on the way to Main Street, and the hill comes down over the tracks. A young woman is walking from evidently her residence to the downtown. The way to get there from A to B is across the tracks. To all aboard Florida, she's a trespasser. To me, she's simply a citizen in Indian River County going from her home to basically the lagoon. I don't see her as a criminal. I don't see her as a trespasser. I see her as a reasonable person doing a reasonable thing in a day-to-day activity. But those reasonable things and what safety requirements are necessary to address those reasonable things have not been discussed. Until All Aboard Florida shows a real concern for the actual lives of our citizens, again, I don't think this discussion is going to get too far. Thank you.
Regarding safety, this question is for you, Mr. Reininger, and was submitted from our local firefighters union. Currently, we do not have the training, equipment, or heavy vehicles necessary to respond effectively if a major train incident was to occur in our county. The same can be said for dealing with hazardous materials, either train fuel or as a result of an accident involving another train carrying such materials. Is All Aboard Florida planning on assisting our emergency services district with training, equipment, or funding for what we feel are important safety concerns for our county?
So a very interesting question, actually. So let's take those systematically sort of in pieces. First of all, with regard to the issue of hazardous materials, the passenger trains don't carry hazardous materials.
He was addressing, like I said, if there was an accident involving another train, since you are going to have the true tracks going, or the fuel that the train carries itself.
Yeah, so in fact, you can survey train systems across the country, and you will find that there really is no special equipment or devices that are necessary to respond to incidences as they happen as a result of train traffic along train corridors. It's just simply the way it is. Again, these trains have been running on this corridor for over 100 years. From time to time, there have been minor incidences. There's never been an issue where there was a lack of equipment or available resources in order to respond to that. With regard to training as a part and parcel of the program that we're going to be instituting, in fact, in some instances, we've already begun this in some of our first phase areas. We have, in fact, had meetings with and arranged for training programs with the local first responders so that they know, among other things, how to make contact with the railroad in the case of an emergency, how to respond to the issues that might arise. Ultimately, as the new equipment, meaning our rolling stock, becomes available into the system, we will in fact have training with those local first responders so that they are familiar with the nature of the rolling stock and how the emergency exits and those sorts of things work. The simple fact of the matter is there isn't anything peculiar, there isn't anything specific, and there isn't anything that is particularly complicated associated with emergency exits or any of those sorts of things with regard to that. So if you were to sort of explore the particular issue in analog situations anywhere else in the country, what you find is there really isn't a need for specific equipment to address potential issues that arise out of the result of that. But to stay on the generalized issue of safety for just a moment, I want to make it abundantly clear. What we are committing to with regard to safety is 100% of the investment necessary to accommodate all of the requirements to meet all of the recommendations of all of the jurisdictional authorities associated with the operating characteristics of All Aboard Florida as a passenger rail system in our right-of-way. Let me repeat that. All of the investment necessary to achieve all of the compliance with the latest, most stringent safety requirements are going to be part and parcel of the investment of All Aboard Florida. Simple as that.
This question is for Commissioner Solari. As I stated earlier, one of the guiding principles of the Taxpayers Association is our belief that limited government is the most effective way to govern, both nationally and here locally at the grassroots level. Included with that is our desire to see government interfere as little as possible with private property rights. Please reconcile your strong beliefs in limited government with your position on All Aboard Florida, and specifically All Aboard Florida's claims that these are their private tracks and local governments are attempting to interfere with their ability to operate effectively as a private company, i.e. specifically private financial disclosures, etc., being given to local governments or the public.
I say that's a two-part question, limited government and property rights. I'll answer property rights first. How many people in this room have a home? How many of you have regulations which the county suggests what you can or cannot do with your home? All of you. The idea of property rights is not an absolute right, it's a very important right. And I grant it, I love property rights. But there are still obligations to the community. We all understand that. For some reason, All Aboard Florida seems to have a hard time with that. And these property rights have been diminished over the last 150 years, particularly as we get a more crowded and crowded society. That's just something that happens. I don't like it, but it's a fact. And one of the reasons why I think All Aboard Florida might be having such a hard time with this is because they don't understand that the world has changed in the last 120 years since Flagler came down the coast, which had very few people in the 1890s. But the world has changed. And our rights are being changed and altered on a daily basis. And we all need to understand that. We can fight that process, and I welcome the fight. But we have to understand that that's a process and that's a reality which we're all faced with. Now the second one is even more interesting, limited government. I am a champion of limited government, as is the Taxpayers Association, but I hate to break this to them. Limited government is not the end. It's not, as Aristotle says, the telos. It is a means to the end. And I believe that limited government is the best means to an end for America and for most countries in the world. But from an elected official's perspective, what is the end? The end is good order. Limited government, property rights, the rule of law, free markets, these are all means to the end, which is good order in our society. And why should your government believe in good order? Because in an American democracy, your government should believe that you are autonomous individuals capable of leading and living your own life. So that your government should do no more but all it can to provide that basic good order so that you can flourish day to day and raise your family the way you believe it should be. So, limited government is crucial, but the end is good order so that we can all have the life that we believe we ought to. Thank you.
This question is for Mr. Reininger. Regarding the many quality of life issues that have been raised in All Aboard Florida, how much corporate planning has gone into future funding towards protecting and preserving our local community's environment? This is important since so many of our residents have chosen to live here as opposed to larger, more urban areas, specifically due to the very special makeup of our local landscape.
So the very important first part of the answer to that question is really an understanding of what the nature of the intervention of All Aboard Florida on the existing right-of-way really looks like in this local community, absent a stop. As was appropriately described many times here today, we're talking about 32 32 passenger trains a day that are going to be moving 16 northbound, 16 southbound in a day. The time it takes for a train of our system to pass by any one point along the system is something on the order of magnitude of 15 seconds. Perhaps even a modest bit quicker in this particular part of geography. the amount of time that it would take a train to cross an intersection, including the safety interventions that would need to be made in order to make it possible to ensure that the intersection is in fact safe, is about 45 seconds. That will happen 2 times an hour from the operating hours of our system for in this particular area is going to be somewhere around 7:30 in the morning for the first time and somewhere around 10 or 10:30 at night for the last time. Very simple math associated with that means that 97% of the time that you're out and about in the community, you will have no intervention whatsoever with one of our trains. Only 3% of the time would you physically be able to be in contact in one form or another with where our trains are. Through the establishment of this ultimately very safe corridor and through the very limited amount of time that the trains will actually be in the environment that we're speaking about, that very simple reality tells you that there is incredibly limited intervention whatsoever by our system into the environment at all. And so you start with the fact that there is almost no impact at all to begin with. You overlay on top of that issues like the safety improvements that we've committed to, which will in fact be a resultant benefit to the quality of the safety configuration of the environment that we're talking about. That's sort of the next level. I would also point out that it has been our stated objective that further benefits that have long-standing desire and have long-ranging benefits, like the notion of quiet zones, are something that we are very hopeful will also become a reality in the second phase of our project, as they already have in our first phase of the project. The ability to make that happen is very, very real. It takes only a modest amount of cooperative effort between ourselves and the local communities to get through that process. The reality here also is that the way they happen is by an application process that has to be initiated by the community. We can't do it. We can support it, we can help it, but we can't do it. It has to be initiated by the local community. We have assisted in that process in our first phase. We look forward to doing the same thing into the second phase. The second important reality is that in order to achieve that level of safety accommodation that would allow for the substitution of warning horns to be eliminated, it requires the investment in a whole series of safety improvements that ultimately get determined as the counterbalance to otherwise the blaring of a horn as a warning device. What's very interesting with the second phase of the project is our trains will actually operate, as we've said, at a higher speed in the second phase of the project than they do in the first phase of the project. That's in part because of the improvements to the rail infrastructure that we're making that will accommodate those speeds, and also because the reality of it is there's less density in this particular part of the geography, which will allow for the trains to operate safely at those speeds in this part of the geography. The consequence of that is that the higher speed requires a higher level of investment on our part in order to achieve the safety standards that we've committed to. That means virtually all of the remaining investment that would necessarily be required in order to achieve that quiet zone status has already been accommodated in our investment program, even to a greater degree than the almost de minimis degree that we have seen happen in the first phase of our project. That's what we're trying to make everybody understand. And understand, that's not only a benefit associated just because of All Aboard Florida. It's not just the All Aboard Florida trains that won't be blowing their horns. All trains won't be blowing their horns, including the existing and future freight trains that will continue to operate on this corridor today. And so in one of many ways, that I think is a direct answer to your question about what we're doing over the long term to ensure that the intervention of All Aboard Florida into this right-of-way is a sustainable and a sort of forward-thinking venture on our part.
This question goes to Commissioner Solari regarding pledged collateral from AAF, since Mr. Reininger brought it up earlier. Do you feel that AAF has pledged sufficient collateral to protect the taxpayers if AAF were to default on the RIF loan they have applied for? And do you feel this information has been made available to both local governments and the public, and should they be forced to release that information to local government or the public?
Well, I have not seen it. I don't know exactly what the collateral is. And until you know exactly what that collateral is, it's difficult to make any assessment. Do I think that they should? Yes, I think that all the details of the RIF loan should be made public. I think that's a very basic thing. What do I do know? Well, I do know that what I've heard, what I believe is that about $400 million of the money is going to be used to improve signaling system. That a good portion of that money is going to be used for the second track. That a good amount of that money is going to be used to improve the present railroad that exists today. All fine and good, but All Aboard Florida doesn't own that railroad. That's owned by another one of those fortress companies. My understanding is that All Aboard Florida simply has an easement to use that railroad. So you put all of these fixtures into the ground. If something should happen to All Aboard Florida, all of those fixtures are basically going to stay in the ground. And it's simply my belief that as all of those fixtures stay in the ground, and some, very unclear because again, I don't know the nature of them, some of those rights may migrate back to the federal government. What is the federal government going to do? It's going to add another Amtrak line, which it's then going to have to subsidize for the next 50 years, 100 years. And I don't believe it ought to. So, at the end of the day, I would welcome a clear outline of all the collateral and the terms and use of that collateral that's going to be used, and that would help. But at the end of the day, until we can get a full picture, until I, as an elected official, can get a full picture, which would include not only that information about the collateral, but an investment-grade business plan which can be looked at and analyzed, then I cannot fulfill my fiduciary duty to the citizens of Indian River County. And as I do believe that it's a subsidy, then I believe we're going in the wrong direction.
For Mr. Reininger, Ray McNulty recently wrote an article on July 31st in Vero Beach's 32963, where he asked the following question of AAF officials. Does All Aboard Florida plan to provide the good people of Indian River County with the same sealed corridor safety upgrades that the state last week ordered the company to install at nearly 40 road crossings between West Palm Beach and northern St. Lucie County? He then went on to state in the text of the article that he had difficulty obtaining a definitive answer from All Aboard Florida. Seeing as how you are the president of All Aboard Florida, can you please answer that question here today?
Sure. Actually, a pretty complex question, and at the risk of this being categorized as a half-truth, let me explain the details of what is essentially a complex question. It starts with a fact, which is there is no such thing as a straightforward and direct definition of what a sealed corridor is. I, more than anyone, wish there was, because if it was black and white, we could simply adhere to it. The truth of the matter is, the concept of a sealed corridor is an aggregation of a certain set of options and or variable approaches to deal with individual situations that would otherwise need to be made in order to achieve a safety standard. It's also true that there are multiple jurisdictions that need to be satisfied here. There's the Federal Railway Administration, who ultimately provides a set of guidelines. There's the Florida Department of Transportation, who in fact has jurisdiction over the improvements that are made around the grade crossings. And when we talk about the notion of sealed corridors, we're really talking about the improvements around grade crossings themselves. And so the direct answer to the sort of central portion of the question is, are we accommodating the recommendations of a sealed corridor throughout the entirety of our program? And the answer to that is absolutely. It is part and parcel of the entire program, which I said several times today, is entirely funded by the investment of All Aboard Florida. But you really need to understand more directly how that comes about. And it comes about out of what has been described as an incredibly tedious process, whereby a group of experts, engineers, our program managers, city managers, city engineers, the Federal Railway Administration, the Florida Department of Transportation have to painstakingly go out in every single one of the grade crossings that exist in the corridor and survey the situation. I've described these as snowflakes. No two of them are the same. The situation that exists in each and every one of them is different from the one right next door. And so that has to be cataloged in its existing condition, and then a range of possible solutions that would achieve the status that is generally described of as a sealed corridor needs to be determined. Sometimes those recommendations and those jurisdictions are at cross purposes with each other. And then in those instances, those officials need to determine what the right compromise situation is that will wind up in a result that in effect does meet a combined set of circumstances that makes everybody comfortable that we are achieving the level of standard that they are looking for with their recommendations and with their jurisdictions. That's a very complicated answer because it's a very complicated question. Here's the facts. So far today, that entire process has been concluded for the first phase of our project. So far today, the very first important step of that for the second phase of our project, which includes this local geography, which is to say the grade crossing diagnostic, has been completed. The next step of the process, which is happening now, is the very definitive set of requirements that will come out as a result of the learnings that diagnostic has generated as a result of its first phase. From there, those solutions become the engineered aspects of the final component of the project. That information ultimately, once it gets to an adequate level of engineering, about the 90% completion range, that information is then made back available for approval to the jurisdictional agencies, but as a matter of course, we've been making that available to the local authorities as well, so that they're fully aware of what the plans are for us to accommodate those requirements associated with a sealed corridor. So I hope that in part makes clear the answer to that question.
This question is for Commissioner Solari. There are some who have stated this is a private enterprise matter and therefore question any taxpayer dollars being used for attorneys and/or consultants in regards to the All Aboard Florida project. Others feel the hiring of attorneys puts the county in an antagonistic position rather than a cooperative one with the company we may be dealing with for a very long, extended period of time. Please respond to those taxpayers' concerns.
One of the things I learned very early on in this process was that the Fortress Investment Group of companies has a lot of very smart people. And I understand that Mr. Reininger thinks that they're all separate and have evidently no connection with each other. But for some reason, Mr. Signorello of FECI, the president of FECI, was brought into my office to have a discussion about this. So pardon me for thinking that every line is not perfectly clear. But Mr. Signorello is clearly an extremely bright individual. As a matter of fact, the Fortress Group of companies is filled with a lot of very bright, intelligent people. A number of these people, like Mr. Reininger, know a lot about rail. And matter of fact, I know very little about rail. Our county attorneys know very little about rail. Most of the citizens in this community don't know too much about passenger rail. So in order to fulfill my obligation as a commissioner, I felt it's certainly necessary to get the type of legal advice and backup that would be appropriate for the citizens of our community. And it was interesting that the other day at the High Speed Rail Commission, Brian Henny said, no, you shouldn't be getting a lawyer ahead of the time. That is antagonistic. No. In business, the best time to get a lawyer is before you sign the contract, before you have a problem. I was in business a number of years. We had a very good attorney. We were never in court. So the fact that we have an attorney does no more than show that we understand that the community has a number of needs, that we're up against people who are working with people, however you want to put it, that are very bright. One of the comments that Mr. Signorello, who I believe was a South Florida Business Journal Deal Maker of the Year in 2011, said was that when you do or deal with this type of project, the first thing you do is get the smartest bankers, attorneys, and accountants that you can. That was the line that told me that the citizens of Indian River County deserve the best legal assistance that we could get. Thank you.
And this will be the final question for Mr. Reininger, and then we will go to the summary portion of today's event. Mr. Reininger, do you have a corporate impact study of what happens within 1 mile east and west of the tracks? For example, the impact on business, population, residential, and commercial real estate property tax values? If so, has that been made available to the public, or will it be part of the EIS study? And what is your best thoughts on when that EIS study will be made available?
So first of all, I'd just like to say, Bob, we found something that we absolutely agree on. And that is, I completely agree that the citizens of this area should avail themselves of all the expertise that they need to completely and adequately assess this situation, whatever that may be. I completely support that point of view, whatever you determine that to be. We certainly have employed a range of experts to help educate us about the details of the scenario. There's going to be a comprehensive study that gets released sometime very soon. In part answer to your question, when, I don't exactly know. We're incredibly hopeful that we're talking about a few days from now, but we ultimately don't know the answer to that question. And when it comes out, we think it's nothing but the appropriate thing to do to fully understand and digest the information that will be contained in that very comprehensive environmental impact statement. The environmental impact statement is not the first time something like this has happened. It is a tried and true process that has existed within the NEPA legislation for quite some time. It's designed specifically to address the kinds of questions and issues that are being raised in this forum here today. It's being conducted by a range of federal authorities and their paid consultants in order to, on behalf of the public, fully assess the impacts of the project itself, and we look forward to the continued dialogue around the details and the results of that process and those documents when they become known. As it stands today, we have no more insight into the contents of those documents than do you, except for the component parts of that document that we produce for their analysis, which is to say the things that they had to ask us in order to understand what it was that needed to be analyzed, like the hours of operation of our system and those sorts of things that only we could provide information around. You asked a specific question around the issue of property values, and we don't have a commission study to assess the effects or issues associated with property value with any proximity to our railroad. We have been incredibly studious about all of the information that has been generated in the past in analog situations. What we believe is that there really is no conclusive evidence one way or another about the effects on property values associated with rail in general and specifically with passenger rail. We have studied all of the documentation in detail, and what we come to understand is that most times when there are studies that presume some negative result in property values, that those property values are really associated with freight trains, not with passenger trains. In fact, there are many studies that show quite the opposite, that the introduction of passenger service into corridors drives significantly increased property values for the properties that are adjacent to that passenger rail service. With respect to freight systems,
Eric, please.
With respect to freight systems, one of the other things that we've come to learn from those previously done studies is perhaps the single biggest issue associated with any negative effects of freight operations comes from not the train itself, but from the noise associated with the horn that is heard well beyond the limits of the corridor. In this particular case, the idea of the quiet zones makes that entire issue moot, or maybe more appropriately said, mute. To the extent that we can eliminate the horns, you eliminate the nexus of that issue entirely. And the other thing that we've come to learn from many of these studies is that the real issues associated with freight traffic and an effect on surrounding property values has to do with the introduction of new freight services where previously there wasn't any. And in this particular case, we're talking about a freight service that's been in continuous operation for 100 years. So the introduction of a few more trains in there is not likely to have any effect one way or another on the property values around. So that is our perspective on that issue.